no-till to blame a lot of potential issues and things that may or come up that may or may not have anything to do with the fact that you went, to no-till all of your crops. So you've got to have that mindset that you want to make it work and make it as successful as possible without automatically just blaming the fact that you went to no-till for some other problems that may or may not have anything to do with that. And the other thing, as we will transition into going over some things on the planner, is if you are, in whatever stage of tillage system you are now, whether that's, a field cultivator or just vertical tillage or a chisel plow, and you're going to go to no-till, and the only thing you do is take out the tillage, that is not a great way to transition into no-till. If the only thing you change is taking out the tillage part of your operation, that's not a great prescription for success. And what I mean by that is not only are you taking out the tillage, but you need to think about planter setup. You need to think about the hybrids you're going to choose and the soybean varieties and wheat, any of those things. Most seed guides show, a rating for no-till these days. So, if you've been one that's typically not looked at those kind of things in a seed guide, I would definitely strongly encourage that, and make sure you have that discussion with your seed supplier as well, that, hey, we're going to go to no-till. What hybrids do you recommend since we're going to go to no-till? So that's definitely a discussion I would have. The other thing is discussing with your agronomist about your nutrient management plans. If you just do the same thing in tillage or in no-till that you did in tillage, nutrient management wise, that may not be the best setup. Now you may not have to make major changes when you're transitioning, but again, have that discussion with your agronomist and make sure they're aware, because that may or may not change some of the prescriptions that they're advising you on as you're going to transition into no-till. Because you can have the best planter setup in the world, but if there's certain pH issues or things like that going on out there, those may show up more when you go to a no-till system. So you want to make sure that those discussions happen. And then also, if you do your own spraying, make sure you talk to your chemical rep. If you hire your spraying done, there again, make sure you talk to your local retailer about that, because you want to make sure they're aware that you're making that switch, that they're making recommendations based on the actual system that you're going into. All of those pieces need to work together. Again, if you just take out the tillage, you're going to miss all of those other discussions that should have happened, that'll help ensure a much higher rate of success. So transitioning into the planter, there's a lot of mechanics that go on with the planter, but the thing you need to remember is that you're asking the planter to not only evenly space the seed, place it at the depth you want, but now it's also going to do what your tillage tool used to do. You're going to rely on the planter to do a little bit of tillage, even though we call it no-till, right there where it's placing the seed, and drop the seed still in that most accurate fashion. And I'm specifically talking about corn, but soybean placement's important too, but definitely very critical on corn. So, your attention to detail as you go through the planter is very critical on that, because again, we're asking the planning unit to do everything instead of planning into this pre-made fluff like we do in a tillage system. So the first and foremost is your opener blades. You want to make sure they're good and sharp. A lot of folks have discussions about when to replace these. Most folks will talk about, because most disc openers start at 15 inches, and when you go down to 14 and a half, that's when they recommend replacing them. What we more look at is do we still have a good sharp edge? I really get less concerned about actual how much diameter we've lost. Now, obviously, we're going to lose the sharp edge long before we would get below 14 and a half in a no-till. Most of the time what happens is this beats across rocks, because we're very blessed with rocks here in Noble County where we're at. You'll start to see dings and things on the opener blades where they've wore just a little bit, but it starts to create a blunt surface there. And so that's when we'll look at changing them. Again, it's important to still look at the wear, but that's what we look for is are we getting, not a nice sharp edge there, because again, we want it to penetrate the soil, cut the residue, not hairpin it in there. Blade contact is important up here. And a lot of you've probably heard of the business card trick. You're going to put business cards in here and then measure the distance between. Most manufacturers recommend around 2-inch contact area. Consult your book to know specifically for your brand of planter. It should say in it what that contact area is, but that is very critical in no-till, because again, it's doing the tillage, so everything's wanting to force those openers either further apart or more together. Most of the time further apart. I kind of learned through the years that if you're just wanting to do a quick check in season, depending on how many acres you run and those kind of things, to know if that's still within tolerance, I'll just run each blade opposite direction and see how much resistance there is. I mean, if there's a decent amount of resistance, it's probably still okay. If it spins pretty free, then you definitely got a problem. You don't have the amount of contact area you have, and if you can't turn them at all against each other in this motion, then they're probably getting too tight, which would be unusual within the season that they would be too tight. But that's a quick way in season to know. Be very careful, disclaimer here, that you don't get your fingers pinched or cut when you do that. So maybe wear gloves if you're going to do that, but I do that about halfway through the season just to see. And sometimes we have an opener bearing that's starting to get bad, and that's usually why in season we would see where they're not as tight as they should be. Because again, in no-till, there's a lot more pressure on the bearings, because remember, imagine your field cultivator shovel, we're asking the opener to kind of do that same thing. So it creates a lot more force on those bearings to, continue doing the job it needs to do and holding the opener where it needs to be. Moving ahead of the openers, this is where there's always a lot of discussion about what to have on a planter. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't have on your planter. This is what we run. This particular brand of planter offers a frame mounted coulter, no-till coulter. It is not part of the row unit. In our stony fields that we have, again, the glaciers were really good to us, making sure we had plenty of stones here in Noble County. We really like this setup. It takes a lot of stress off of the row units, the parallel linkage, having that. The problem with this setup though is trying to get these set in relationship to the depth that the openers are running, because you want the opener to do the last. If you're running a no-till coulter, you want the opener to do the last little bit of opening in the trench. You don't want the coulter going as deep or deeper than the opener, because we want the seed placed in that nice V trench down in the bottom. And if this is going deeper, it can create air pockets below the seed as the planting unit putting it there. So that is a challenge with this setup, because you have a gap in time and a gap in relationship here between the two. Now there are unit mounted, the planting unit mounted coulters, and those are a lot easier to get set because it's a very direct relationship in those. Then there's row cleaners, and then there's some coulter row cleaner combos. a lot of folks run just row cleaners and don't even have no-till coulters, and that's fine. I mean, again, it depends on your planter, your soils, where you are in the world. I'm not here to say that row cleaners are better than coulters, and I'm not here to say that coulters are better than row cleaners. If you're just starting out, before you spend a bunch of money on iron to add to your planter, what I would recommend is if you could find some used items to put on there, especially like if you could find wheat stubble, something like that you could play with in the summer to kind of see what you liked. Or if you don't have wheat, find a neighbor that maybe would let you come over, or in the fall after bean harvest, go out with the planter. I know everybody's got a lot of extra time in the fall, but before you go buying 12 or 16 or 6 or 4 or 24 of something, and you're not even sure if that's a route you want to go, that's something I would recommend, is if you could find some used ones to try, or just buy one new one and maybe put a coulter on one, put a row cleaner on another row, and take it out in a field someplace and see how it works for you. Do you like that? Do you not like that? The one thing I will say about row cleaners is I see a lot of folks try to use those as strip tillage, and they're not. I mean, if you're moving a lot of dirt with row cleaners, they're probably set too aggressive. They should just, again, row cleaners, not row tillage wheels. So they should just be sweeping the residue away, maybe move just a little bit of soil, but not very much at all. They're not designed. I see fields where there's actually trenches where they have the row cleaner set so aggressive, and that one, they're not designed to do that. That's going to shorten the life of a row cleaner. But also two, that's you don't want that. You just want to move the residue off to the side. But again, I'm not here advocating for one or the other. And then of course, control of row cleaners. I mean, there's manual, air, hydraulic, as far as how aggressive you want them set. There's sensors you can put on them that can change them on the fly. And there again, that's going to depend on your operation. Can you justify the expense of those extra things that go with not only the row cleaner, but the things to control that. Moving ahead of the coulters, I think starter fertilizer, especially on corn and no-till, is very important. I wouldn't want to go to the field without it. Someday, as we get into more cover crops and more diverse mixes, maybe we can rethink that approach. But today, with where our soils are, I think starter fertilizer is important. Those of you out there that are farming, you'll notice this has dry fertilizer on it, which is pretty unusual nowadays. Most planters are set up on liquid. We've had a lot of discussion with our agronomist about liquid versus dry. He tells us that really there's no agronomic advantage to switch from one to the other, just that liquid's a lot more convenient. And I definitely won't argue with that point. But dry fertilizer is a lot cheaper form of nutrients. So we've stuck with dry and made a lot of effort to stick with dry. Trust me, to find a 12-row dry fertilizer planter, there is not one of those around every corner. We had to go clear down to almost Louisville when we bought this planter to find a used planter with dry fertilizer. And new planters, I mean, if you're looking at a 4 or a 6-row or even an 8-row without much folding, you can still get dry fertilizer on a new planter. But you step up to a folding planter in a 12, 16, or 24, there's not very many options at that point to stick with dry fertilizer. But don't take that to mean that you have to have dry fertilizer to make no-till work. The takeaway here is definitely I would recommend starter fertilizer. And again, a discussion to have with your agronomist about what kind of starter to have on there. But we had to get some the OEM fertilizer openers did not cut it in no-till. They just weren't heavy duty enough to get the fertilizer placed at the depth we wanted. So we had to go an aftermarket route to make that happen. And that is regardless of form, whether liquid or dry. That's something you got to make sure you're getting the fertilizer placed where you want it in no-till. Moving back to the actual row unit. And this is something, I mean, even if you're in a tillage system, that most folks do, but you got to make sure your metering units are in good shape. That, you know, if you know someone that can test them for you, you know, talk to the manufacturer, the OEM. Usually each planter has a seed size or flats or versus rounds on corn that a planter likes. I mean, our book says medium rounds. So we actually order seed very early, unfortunately too early sometimes, because we're ordering it before we've harvested the corn we planted, and we may not know what hybrids work well, but we're pretty committed to wanting to stick with medium rounds so that, again, that seed disc has the best chance of holding on to the seed in a no-till condition. Because remember, you know, when this hits a rock, it's not in fluff. I mean, it's in stable soil, and so it's a little more violent, you know, when the row unit hits that. So we want to make sure that we have the seed size and the seed round or flat that the planter calls for, again, so that it can do the best job it can at singulating that seed and placing it in an evenly spaced picket fence stand, which is so critical on corn. So every year these all come off. I take them apart. There's not much to adjust on these row units or metering units on this planter, but we look at all the brushes, make sure everything turns free. There's some roll pins and things that hold the disc. I check those to make sure that you know, they're all in, not any cracks or anything like that. So definitely something you want to make sure you're keyed in on. Moving below the metering unit. Well, to continue with the metering unit, I guess I'll talk about this planter still uses chains. It's all still a mechanical planter. I guess in our operation, I would kind of term us as the kings of obsolete, where we pretty are old school on a lot of things. And we, you know, if we're going to adopt new technology, it's got to pencil out. And I'll be the first to admit, though, it's got to be pretty good if we're going to adopt very much new technology. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing. Don't take it that way, but it kind of comes back to a mindset thing. We're just not, you know, real tech people. I'll be the first to admit that. As Joel was trying to set up the meeting this morning, I'm definitely not the person to ask about that. So we still run all mechanical, all chains, which it can still be successful. It's not like corn won't grow if it's planted with a planter that still has a chain driven system. It can affect singulation on the seed placement, but that's why we really look to make sure chains are nice and free, all the idlers turn free, make sure everything's good and clean. And we also make sure we look at the back of the planter with the unit off, make sure the chains are all in line. And that goes for everything. The fertilizer is chain driven, the row units are chain driven, and all of that stuff's got to be clean, free, because any jump anywhere in the system, I mean, this planter has two transmissions, one on each side that drives each half of the planter. One jump in that affects 6 rows. So we just screwed up singulation on 6 rows if there's a chain with a kink in it somewhere or something like that. So we really try to go through all the chains with a fine-tooth comb to make sure they're in good shape. And we probably change them too often. They're probably long from wore out, but we just know that again, one hiccup anywhere on one side of the planter affects 6 rows when you're in a chain driven system. So make sure you key in on that. Make sure everything's, running free, turns easy, doesn't catch anywhere. Those kind of things. Moving to the depth wheels, there again, you want to make sure, look for, any breaks in the tire. You want to make sure they're snug against the disc openers. And something that I kind of discovered through the years, just because of where it's set here, because there's no up force on it, I check it up. I pull it up and then turn it and see, is it pretty snug against the disc openers? Because here it may turn free, but when you pull it up, there may be more drag, and that's kind of hard to see on the camera. But I like to pull them up where they be in the plant position, just to make sure that, when it's in the ground, we've got a little bit of drag here on the disc opener, because that helps keep dirt, mud, residue from getting back in here between this wheel and the disc opener, which can affect depth placement on the seed. This planter actually has an aftermarket system that creates force in, so that it makes it wear evener here. I'm not advertising this, but again, you just want to make sure that these are running nice and snug. Now, don't have them too tight. I'm not a fan of that either, where they're so tight you can't hardly turn them, or that it turns the disc opener. That I think creates unnecessary wear and tear on things that if it's set that tight. Now, if you're in really muddy, sticky conditions, like the spring of 19, that may be something you have to do for that year. Again, very easy in a spring like that to think, well, we're having trouble, we're getting mud packed in here. Let's just get out the Salford and dry that out. Well, no, if you're committed to no-till, you're going to have to go back and re-shim these a little snugger to keep mud and residue from packing back in here. So I just inspect all the tires, make sure there's no breaks in the tires, because you want a nice round surface on the tires, because anywhere where there's a break, that's going to be like a lump on your tire on your car as you go down the road. You're going to feel that, and every time this shakes, that affects depth placement of the seed as these openers are running along, because these are what control how deep the blades go in. And also, it's going to create more shake on the row unit, which makes it harder to hold that seed in the disc and singulate it at the correct spacing. You want to see, is there excess play here? You may have to change bushings and or the pivot shaft here, because it may have excess wobble in and out. As you can see, this one doesn't move. And you also want to see, are the bearings, how good are they? You have play in the bearings here on the depth wheel. Just things you want to check on everything, on all of them, and replace as necessary. I used to be a believer, if you got a new planter, new to you, I should say, a used planter, that maybe you ought to go through and change all these. We did that on our last planter and had some of the brand new bearings go out in the first year. So maybe that was just our luck, but after that, if the bearings sound good, they don't sound rough when we turn the depth wheel, we leave them and go. And that's actually worked pretty well for us. Then moving clear back, we've opened the trench, put it at the right depth, singulated the seed. Now it's time to close up the seed trench. And there again, I'm not here. There are catalogs full of closing wheels for planters. I'm not here to tell you on any one system. We run a rubber wheel on one side and a spike wheel on the other. This planter has the ability, you can stagger the wheels in dry conditions. You want the spike wheel leading and the rubber trailing. In wet conditions, you want the spike wheel trailing and the rubber leading. I have row units set up on different ways to see through the years if I actually see a difference. So far, I haven't. When we've had emergence issues, it's been across the board, across the whole planter. I can't see that staggering them has made a difference one way or the other. But this setup works well for us. I can tell you if you're planting green, we have not had a lot of trouble with just one spike wheel wrapping. But where we did have trouble is we had some really tall cereal rye we planted into in 2019, and I tried rolling it first just as an experiment. I didn't like that for other reasons, but then it did wrap pretty bad. So if you're planting green, leave it standing, and I think you'll have a lot less trouble with things wrapping if you have spike closing wheels. There's cast ones, there's 2 spike wheels, there's drag chains behind. Couple companies now make a firming wheel that can go behind this. Again, you could be closing wheel poor. I mean, you can dump a lot of money in there, but find what works. And again, just like road cleaners and colders, if I were going to try something new, I would just try it on a row or 2 and see how I liked it before I started buying 24 wheels for a planter. So we run lefts and rights on here, and basically there's lefts and rights of the fertilizer openers, and we just offset them. So if the fertilizer opener's on the right, we put the spike closing wheel on the left, just to try and keep things more even around that seed trench. But one thing in the off season, and this would go, I guess, for anything on the planter that's spring controlled, we relieve all the tension on the closing wheels so that the springs, don't have all that tension on them all throughout the year, and it keeps them a lot more even across the planter, and makes them last a lot longer, in my opinion. But again, if you've just bought a planter, don't know the history, again, a used planter, I would strongly recommend just replacing all of those springs right from the get-go so that everything's even across the planter. So if you set every depth wheel at a notch or a hole, however your planter's set up, that it should be about as even as possible across the whole planter. How we doing on time?
Good, you got 15 more minutes.
All right. Then there's also pivot points on these. And a lot of times they're adjustable as well on the pivot point. And every year, we check to see, is there excess play, in the closing wheels, because if it's not lined right up, if your trench is open like this and your closing wheels are trying to center over here instead of in the dead center here, you're not placing that seed in a really good home. So every year, we've got a grass area down at my dad's place. I take it out, I drop it, drive ahead, get out, look, crawl on my belly, trying to make sure that each closing wheel is exactly dead center of the seed trench to make sure we're getting it closed up like we want to, nice and even closed seed trench in there. And then in season, when I stop to fill with fertilizer, something like that, I'll just take a gander, because usually I have the planter down to do that, and usually I'll look and see, are things still pretty lined up. I don't get as critical on it because I usually have less time at that point, but just to see if something smacked a rock sometime or something like that, and tweak something where it's not dead center over the row, something that's glaring. Hopefully you notice that. And really that goes for anything on the planter. When you're stopping to fill, I would really recommend, especially in no-till, you take 5 minutes, 2 minutes, whatever, 90 seconds to just, walk through, look at things just real quick to see if something's out of whack, out of adjustment, or if something's broke. Because that's a good time to catch stuff like that before, you've planted 100 acres and you've got things that weren't performing like they should be. The last thing on the row unit itself is down pressure. This is still, again, mechanical, being an all mechanical planter. It has the heavy duty down pressure kit for this manufacturer. In no-till, that's a must. I mean, whatever that looks like from your OEM, you want the heavy duty down pressure kit. Now there are pneumatic and hydraulic down pressure systems out there. I think those are great. But it's hard at this point for us to justify the investment on this planter. Probably when we'll jump to that's when we would go and just buy a planter with that already on it rather than purchase it separately and put on this. The other thing I like about this being mechanical is that it just works. I mean, as long as the springs aren't broke, it works. But it is tougher to make changes for varying field conditions. I mean, you're committed. If you hit a sandy spot in the field, it's probably going to have too much down pressure for that spot. You're trying to hit a happy medium for the field conditions. And a good way to check, whether you have too much, too little, put the planter down, drive ahead a little bit, and see if when it's in the ground, can you spin this depth wheel? I mean, if you can spin it pretty easy, it don't have enough down pressure. If you can't turn it at all, it's got way too much. You want just some drag on there, and you're going to want to check that. I don't know as you have to check it every field, but most of you probably know your fields. You know what your heavy ground, your light ground, and when you're switching from those different soil types as the predominant one in that field, you might want to check that when you get to that field, because you may need to make an adjustment on that. One thing I did forget to mention about the closing wheels, in 2012, we actually ditched the spike. Because if you remember, 2012 was really dry in the spring, of course, dry the whole rest of the year. And we actually had trouble with it not closing the trench because the spike was actually literally holding the closing wheel up. This one wasn't really even contacting the ground. So we ditched the spike and put the rubber one back on so it would crumble on top and not hold it up so high that this wheel wasn't even doing anything. So again, things you need to think about, as you're no-tilling, there may be adjustments that you have to make. Just, the way you set the planter in the shop may not be the way it has to be set the whole year. But back to down pressure, if you have spring down pressure, and again, you have a planter that you have no clue when the springs were changed last, that's an investment I would make. Again, like the closing wheels, I would definitely replace all those springs, because then everything's the same. You set each row unit in the same hole. Should be all even across the planter. Then the last thing on the row unit is parallel linkage bushings. There's bushings in here on each of these bolts where it pivots. And if there's excessive play, you can pick the row unit up and there's play in it. It's time to change the bushings. The thing that frustrates me is that manufacturers don't make the bushing softer than the arms. So eventually you get to a point where you may have to change the arms, because just by changing the bushings, new bushings doesn't take all the play out of it. And we're starting to get there on this planter. I mean, this planter is a 2000, so it's approaching 21 years old. And we've replaced the bushings twice since we've had it. And it's getting to that point that possibly the next time we may have to think about getting new arms, or there is some aftermarket companies that make some kits that you can repair your existing arms. But the problem with that is, again, if you're running through fluff and tillage, you're not going to notice play so much. But if you're no-tilling, any play here, that affects how the row unit, it can tip side to side, it can tip forward to back, And that all of this is designed to run level. I mean, all of this is engineered, the openers, to run level, not have the row unit tip forward, back. If you do that, that screws up everything. It's not engineered to run that way. Which leads me to, for some reason on this planter, when it's in the ground, if you suck a cylinders clear in that lift it, these arms are not parallel with the ground, and it should be. Okay, every planter, I don't care what frame configuration it is, when the planter's in the ground and you're going across the field, you know, find a level spot in your field to check that. I know in our part of the world that may be kind of tough, but find a level spot with it in the field, get on a four-wheeler or a UTV or something off to the side and watching, is that parallel linkage parallel to the ground? If it's not, you need to fix that, because again, if it's running too high, that again, this is not engineered for this not to run parallel with the toolbar, the main frame beam of the planter. It messes up depth placement. It'll mess up the ability of the closing wheels to properly close the trench. And it's going to be erratic. You're going to have seeds placed at all different depths throughout the field. So it's very critical to get that set. In this planter, we actually had to put the stop donuts on the cylinders because we could not get it to set where it needed to, this toolbar. And I don't know why that is, but the easiest solution was to just get the right thickness donuts on the cylinders in there, so that when they suck in, they stop at the right place, so that the actual transport wheels are holding the toolbar at the level it needs to be, so that these arms are parallel. That's super critical. You don't want the row unit nose diving, and you don't want it rearing up, because that just, again, messes everything up. And really that would go for a tillage system as well, but it's going to be more pronounced where, again, you're forcing this row unit to do what your tillage implement used to. So, and then the best thing I could tell somebody that's starting out no-tilling is slow down. That is, to me, one of the biggest keys of success. If you think you're going to no-till at 6-7 mile an hour, I would not recommend that, not in our part of the world with the stones that we have and the soils we have. And if you don't believe me, if you can do it, get a UTV again or a four-wheeler, watch the planter in the field in no-till at 6 or 7 mile an hour. Watch the row unit. I mean, it's just going to be doing this all the time. I mean, because there's stones, maybe uneven soil. Luckily, this planter has walking depth wheels, so unevenness is not as big an issue, but you just can't plant that fast, not in our part of the world, in my opinion. I usually plant between 3.5 to 4.2 mile an hour. If we're in a field that has very little stones and I know it's good and level, we may get up to 4.5, but very unusual to go over 4.5. And if you're having trouble doing that, slowing down, have the person that works on the planter ride with you, because if that person that has to replace all those broken parts from driving too fast is sitting beside you with a baseball bat, I have a feeling you'll get a little more motivated to slow down. But again, at the end of the day, slow down. And the other thing, when you go that fast, again, remember, it's doing the tillage. The faster you go, the physics of going faster, the planter is going to want to start to come out of the ground, you know, kind of like a plane. A plane won't fly until it gets a certain amount of speed build up. I'm not a physics major, I'm an economics major by trade, but the faster you go, the more the planter is going to want to come up out of the ground. It's not going to want to sit down in the ground. So that's another huge benefit to going slower. And I know you're thinking, Derek, well, you know, we got X number of acres to cover and that. Well, the thing to remember is that you're not doing that tillage pass. So you should be saving a lot of time there by not having to run across the field with your tillage tool before you run across it with the planter. But anyways, if you follow the planter, it definitely, I think, will convince you to slow down, because it's unreal when you're behind the planter watching it, how much, if you're going that fast, and then if you slow down, and then if you have like a 20/20 monitor or something like that, I think you'll see the benefits on seed singulation besides of slowing down and allowing the planter to do what it needs to do. Because the seed tubes in here, which I didn't mention earlier, but I think kind of goes without saying, if they've got wear spots on them, they need replaced, and that's for tillage or no-till. But that arc is designed for about no more than 5 miles an hour on a standard seed tube. Now, I know Precision Planting has some tubes that have different designs that can allow you to go faster, but if you're like us, just running a pretty simple planter, with a standard seed tube, that curve is only designed for about a maximum of 5 miles an hour. So again, another reason to keep the speed down and allow the planter what it needs to do. The final thing that I will say on no-tilling is, and a lot of folks probably aren't going to like hearing this, is weight distribution on the planter. Especially since a lot of folks have went to liquid fertilizer. It's and large planters for that matter. You know, the tanks are either on the tractor or 1 or 2 tanks on the planter in the center, or it's a central commodity planter, meaning that's John Deere's term for it. But you have the seed hoppers, 1 central hopper or 2 in the back, and then you have little individual boxes and tubes feeding it to here. To really make no-till work, I am personally not a huge fan of that, because you cannot be having weight evenly distributed across the whole planter. You just cannot beat that. Even if you have auto steer, which is great. I mean, that's a huge benefit. If that's something you can incorporate, we do not have that. That's something I'd like to have someday. But if you're not going to run markers, either have the markers there for weight or do something to replace that weight. Because there is definitely benefit. You need to have weight evenly distributed across the whole planter. And again, for convenience sake, a lot of folks don't want to hear that. So that means that you're going to have to use your farmer ingenuity if you want to continue with centralized seed and fertilizer on the planter. How do we get that weight evenly distributed? And I know some manufacturers, and even there's some aftermarket kits you can buy to put on a planter that creates hydraulic weight transfer. Nothing against the manufacturers. I'm sure they've done a great job of engineering it, but the thing I would pose to you is that if your tillage tool has wings and it's not going in the ground, would you just put weight on the center of it? Probably not. You would probably evenly distribute that weight across. Now, most tillage tools, the hydraulic system on that is not designed to create downforce on it. But think about if you put spacers in the slotted holes on a tillage tool so that that cylinder had to force that wing down, and you only put weight in the center, would you still rely on that hydraulic system to force that wing into the ground? My guess is probably not. Since we're doing this virtual, I can't read your face to see what your reaction is, but that's why I'm such a huge fan of even weight distribution on the planter, because I think about back when we did tillage, if we had a disc or field cultivator, it wouldn't go in the ground. Weight in the center only did about no good. It was great for the center, but it didn't do anything for the wings. So that's why I'm a huge fan of that. So, you know, but there is a lot to be said for the convenience of centralized seed and fertilizer on the planter. But I like the even weight distribution. That is, I think, everything that I wanted to cover. I can take questions, Sheila, if there are any.
There's nothing in the chat right now, but if anyone would like to unmute themselves and go ahead and ask your question to Derek, that would be great. As I say that, Stephanie's typed something into the chat. How do you change planter setup as soil conditions get wetter and you have to plant even if you don't want to? Think spring 2019 on this question.
Yeah. Obviously, we made a lot of changes for 2019, and even then it didn't work as well as it should. So that's a situation where we probably tightened these up, if I remember right, a little more because we were having trouble with mud getting in there. The other thing is we reduced down pressure on the row units considerably in that case. And also in 2019, I'm not recommending this because of compaction issues, but in 2019 we had to do a lot of things I'm not proud of. Let's put it that way. I actually increased the force on the closing wheels because it was so wet. I mean, the soil just wouldn't crumble. And I mean, I literally had to force some mud back over the seed. And to do that, I had to increase the pressure here. Now, I'm sure that created compaction zones around the seed, but an open seed trench, that's no good either. The thing I will say, 2019, we didn't have a choice. But we don't necessarily start when the neighbors do. Because to be honest, this is getting a little beyond Stephanie's question. If it's the right conditions to do tillage, it's probably the right conditions to go no-till. A lot of folks do tillage to dry out the ground, and they're creating a smear compaction layer right there at the tillage depth. Okay, so that doesn't, just because they can doesn't mean it's the right time. So in my experience, if the soil's right to do tillage at the right time, it's probably the right time that you could think about planting too. But I got stuck this field, you can't see it behind us. I got stuck 4 times in it planting in 2019. So there was no ideal time in 2019. But if it's wet enough, like you'll see in catalogs, mud scrapers and things like that, which there are some in here to keep it off the disc openers. You can't see those, but for the depth wheels and stuff, I really don't like planting if I'm in a condition where I need those, because if I have mud sticking to the depth wheel tire, it's too wet. We're creating sidewall smear compaction, those kind of things. But I will say a thing that helped us was actually a cover crop. The cover crop, we had less trouble with sticky soils where we had a cover crop planting green, which we had to plant green, than where we did. So I guess that's pretty much all I have to say on that. If Stephanie has a follow-up question, feel free.
Yeah, Stephanie or anyone else, if you have any questions for Derek, we've got just a few minutes here. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Or you're welcome to type them into the chat as well.
While we're maybe waiting on some questions, Greg mentioned, which we don't have, there is pop-up starter fertilizer where you put it right in the row, right on the seed. And there's different systems of delivering that down to there. I think that can be important in no-till. It's not something that we felt justified the expense of putting that system on this planter on our operation, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be for yours. Again, a discussion I would have with your agronomist that knows your soils, knows your fields, knows your fertility levels, about that. I think pop-up can be a good thing. I don't, just because we don't have it don't mean that I'm against it, but I definitely think it's something that you should look at. But if just have some kind of starter fertilizer on the planter for no-till. That's what I'll say. Whether it's 2x2 in furrow, both, I don't care. Figure that out with your agronomist. Just have something, in my opinion, on no-till. Anything come in, Sheila?
It has not, no.
Not everybody's had enough coffee yet, I guess. If anybody has follow-up questions, feel free, if you go to email me any follow-up questions. You can find my email address. If you just go to the Indiana NRCS home site, there's a link in there for all the service centers across the state. Look at DeKalb County, and there should be a link there for my email on that site. So again, just Google Indiana NRCS homepage, find the map on there for your local service center, which DeKalb may not be your local service center, but if you have follow-up questions for me, feel free to contact me and send me an email. It'll be on there.
Great, thank you, Derek.
Hey, Sheila.
Yes.
Can Derek kind of talk a little bit, and maybe he talked about it a little bit earlier, but maybe some more information about how his nutrient management, his starter fertilizer changed as they were transitioning, or has he taken on, say, a field that wasn't no-till and they converted it to no-till? Like how did he see that change with, say, nutrient management, but also just planter setup changes over time? Like what were, I would guess that some of those fields as they're transitioning are the things that you really have to think about the most critically. So just curious how he made some of those changes, like he went through them, but just some of those changes with a brand new field.
So when we transitioned and to no-till, and we do this if we pick up a new farm, we kind of done both at the same time. We went to no-till and went to VRT, soil management zone sampling, all at the same time, because we really wanted to be pretty prescriptive going into no-till, get it down into, a lot smaller management units on our acres, so that we made sure that everything was in order as we were going into no-till. And we do that with a new field too. We'll get our agronomist to sample it, set it up on soil management zones, so we, usually the big thing we see is pH. Will be out of whack on some zones, and that I mean, pH is so critical on nutrient cycling and everything. I mean, a lot of things revolve around pH. Again, I'm not a soil chemist, but if your pH is not correct, it's going to be pretty tough. And tillage can mask some of that to a certain point, but when you go into no-till, it's going to show up. You may have a hard time hearing me here for a minute. We're blessed at having a railroad track a quarter mile away here, so I'll try to talk a little bit louder. But as far as the starter fertilizer, we change we made over time. We put some ammonium sulfate, so we get some sulfur in there, because we don't have acid rain anymore, and then we'll put some micronutrients in, depending on, especially on those newer fields that Stephanie was asking about, depending on how the soil tests come back. That's usually how, like zinc, boron, those kind of things. If we're got some deficiency issues, we'll run that through the row on the starter, because it's a lot easier to meter it, get it where it needs to be without spending extra dollars, because those micronutrients are really expensive, and we're getting it, placed much more precisely in the ground than if we did that in our broadcast. And that's another reason we like dry starter fertilizer, because it's a lot cheaper and easier to blend those kind of things through our starter versus having to blend it in the broadcast application. As far as planter setup on a new farm, that really just, I pull in the field, drop the planter, check it a couple times, you know, because it may have to adjust some down pressure, may have to adjust some depth, closing wheel things. But I definitely, the number one thing I don't do on a new farm is go from a farm that's been in no-till for a while to a field that hasn't been, and don't get out and check the planter. And that, I know everybody's in a hurry in the spring, but just assuming what worked on your long-term no-till fields for planter setup, and I'm talking adjustments. I'm not going to probably change attachments or anything. I don't do much of that where we're in a newer no-till field versus a long-term, but definitely more just on adjusting and observing what the planter's doing. Are we still getting the seed placed at the depth we want? Are we still, you know, watching the monitor, getting singulation like we want? So, does that answer your question, Stephanie?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Derek.
No problem. Any other questions, Sheila?
No, Stephanie has put a link in the chat box to the NRCS employee contact page. So for anyone who wants to have that handy, you can click on that directly from the chat box.
We want to thank everyone for coming. Derek, thank you so much for taking your time.
My pleasure.
And sharing, and Stephanie, all your questions and for sharing that link. We want to thank CCSI so much for hosting Zoom today. Without you guys, we really couldn't have made this happen. So yeah, big thanks to NRCS, CCSI, and the Allen SWCB. Thanks to all who attended. This is recorded and it will be on our website soon, and it'll also be on our Facebook. So if you know anyone who might be interested in watching, it'll be on our Facebook soon and website, and they can see the recording of that. But once again, thanks all for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.